Please, I am begging you, untie it." The rancher froze, then broke tradition Wild West stories. Jacob Thornton, a rancher in his early 40s, rode slowly along the wide dirt paths that crisscrossed his family's land. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and Jacob knew every corner of it like the back of his hand. From the old wooden barns to the small creek that cut through the pasture, everything was familiar, yet today, the ordinary routine felt heavier, almost different. Jacob adjusted his wide-brimmed hat to shield his eyes from the sun and glanced across the pasture. The cattle were grazing calmly, heads bent low to nibble the dry grass. He had always taken pride in caring for them, knowing that each cow and calf depended on him. He checked the fences as he rode, inspecting each post and wire to make sure the livestock would not wander off. The ranch demanded constant attention, and Jacob had learned from his father that patience and observation were just as important as hard work. As he rode past the eastern fence line, Jacob noticed a figure standing at the edge of the property. At first, he thought it might be one of the neighboring ranchers coming to greet him, but as he drew closer, a feeling of unease settled in his chest. The man looked different from anyone he had seen in these parts. He was disheveled, his clothes torn in places, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. But what caught Jacob's attention most was the stranger's hands. They were tied behind his back. The man swayed slightly, as if he was trying to keep his balance, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Please, I am begging you. Untie it," the stranger said, his voice shaking. The words cut through the stillness of the plains, carrying a raw urgency that made Jacob pause. He felt his horse shift nervously beneath him, sensing the tension in the air. Jacob had been raised with a strict understanding of the ways of the Wild West. Outsiders were treated cautiously. Strangers who entered private property were often confronted and tested. Tradition dictated that one should never trust a person until their intentions were clear. And yet something about the man's eyes, filled with genuine fear, made Jacob hesitate. He reined in his horse and studied the stranger. The rope binding his hands looked crude but tight, likely tied by someone who wanted to make sure he couldn't escape. Jacob's mind raced, trying to figure out who this man could be and why he was here. Was he a criminal fleeing justice, or an innocent man in desperate trouble? The situation was complicated, and following the old rules meant leaving the stranger as he was until the town's lawmen could arrive, or until the man proved himself trustworthy. But Jacob knew that helping someone in need, even if it went against tradition, could sometimes make all the difference between life and death. As Jacob debated his options, he felt a surge of memories from his childhood. He remembered riding alongside his father, learning the ways of the land, and hearing stories about the men and women who had come through their town. Some were honest travelers, caught in trouble by circumstance. Others were troublemakers who had to be handled carefully. His father had always said, "Jacob, a good man does what is right even if the world says otherwise, but a smart man watches closely before he acts." Those words echoed in Jacob's mind now, making the decision feel even heavier. The stranger's voice grew more desperate. "Please, I don't have time. They'll be here soon. You have to help me." He struggled against the ropes, jerking slightly, his eyes pleading. Jacob could see the fear etched in every line of the man's face, and it stirred something deep within him. Despite the warnings and traditions ingrained in him, Jacob felt his heart push him forward. He couldn't ignore someone in such clear danger, even if it meant going against the code he had lived by all his life. Jacob took a slow step off his horse, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots. He kept his hand near the reins but let his eyes never leave the stranger. He spoke in a calm, steady voice, hoping to soothe the man's panic. "Easy, I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "You need to tell me what happened. Why are your hands tied?" The stranger swallowed hard and took a shaky breath. I was traveling from the next town over," he began, his voice still trembling. "Some men, they accused me of something I didn't do. I was trying to get away, and I don't know they were going to catch me. Please, you have to help. If they find me here—" His voice trailed off, but the fear in his eyes was enough to make Jacob understand the gravity of the situation. Jacob studied him carefully. The man did not seem to carry weapons. There were no signs that he had attacked anyone, and yet the story was vague, filled with fear but lacking details. Jacob had to decide quickly. Every moment he waited increased the risk, either for himself or for the stranger. The plains around them were vast, but the isolation could work both ways. If the men chasing this man were ruthless, they might come for him here, on Jacob's land. The choice was clear. He could follow tradition, leave the man tied and wait for the authorities, or he could trust his instincts and act immediately to help. Jacob's hands itched as he considered the rope. It was not just a piece of binding. It represented all the traditions he had grown up with, all the codes that defined his life as a rancher in the West. Breaking it would not be taken lightly by others in the community. Some might call it foolish, dangerous even. Yet, as he looked into the stranger's eyes, he felt a surge of resolve. He remembered the first rule his father had drilled into him. Courage was not just about strength. It was about doing what was right when the world tried to tell you otherwise. He took another careful step forward. The stranger's breathing grew faster, and his shoulders tensed as if expecting a sudden attack. Jacob held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I need you to stay calm." He reached slowly for the rope, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. The man flinched but did not struggle further, clearly relieved that Jacob intended no harm. Every second felt stretched, as if the sun itself had slowed to watch the moment unfold. Finally, Jacob spoke again, his voice firm but kind. "Tell me everything, from the beginning. I need to understand before I do anything." The stranger nodded quickly, grateful for the chance to explain. As he began to recount his story, Jacob listened intently, aware that this was the beginning of something that could change everything. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows over the ranch, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath along with Jacob. The decision he was about to make would not only test the traditions of the Wild West, but also the very core of his own character. Jacob listened closely as the stranger spoke, his voice trembling yet urgent. The man explained how he had been traveling through nearby towns, trying to find work and a safe place to rest, but trouble seemed to follow him everywhere. A group of men had accused him of a crime he did not commit, and they had been chasing him for days. The stranger's explanation was disjointed at first, his words tumbling over each other, but his fear was unmistakable. Jacob could see that he was telling the truth. His eyes darted constantly, as if expecting the hunters to appear at any moment. Jacob felt a knot of tension in his chest. The story confirmed what he had suspected. Leaving this man tied up on his property could be dangerous. The men chasing him might not hesitate to harm anyone who stood in their way, and the stranger's life could be at stake. Yet helping him openly could bring trouble to Jacob as well. The small-town community lived by strict codes, rules that had governed the ranchers for generations. Tradition demanded caution. Outsiders were rarely trusted, and intervening in someone else's conflict could earn criticism, or worse. Jacob took a deep breath, trying to weigh his options. He knew that following tradition would be the safest route for him personally. But was safety more important than doing what was right? His father's words echoed in his mind again. A good man does what is right, even when the world says otherwise. Jacob had always prided himself on being fair and honest, but now he faced a true test of those values. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch. The day was ending, but the weight of the decision made it feel endless. The stranger continued, explaining how he had been running from the men for miles, hiding in forests and behind rocky hills. He described the fear of being caught, of being judged unfairly, of losing everything he had tried to build for himself. Jacob could feel the man's desperation, the way it pressed against him like the heavy air of the plains. It was not a story of criminal intent. It was a story of survival. The stranger's hands were still bound, his body tense, yet he seemed to trust Jacob enough to share every painful detail. Jacob's mind wandered back to his childhood, to the lessons he had learned on this very land. He remembered his father teaching him about fairness, about standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. "You may lose friends, you may face criticism," his father had said, "but no one will ever respect you if you betray your own heart." Those words resonated more strongly now than ever. Jacob realized that the stranger's predicament was not just a test of his courage, it was a test of his character. He shifted his weight, leaning against the fence for a moment. The decision was not easy. Helping this man could draw suspicion or anger from the neighboring ranchers, who adhered strictly to the rules. It could even put his own life at risk if the men chasing the stranger were ruthless enough to come after him on his property. Yet the sight of the tied hands, the pleading eyes, and the evident exhaustion of the stranger made Jacob feel that he had no choice but to act. Compassion, he realized, sometimes demanded courage greater than following tradition. Jacob's horse snorted and pawed at the ground nervously. The tension of the moment seemed to extend beyond the human world, affecting everything around them: the wind, the trees, even the distant mountains that framed the horizon. Jacob reached slowly for the rope but stopped midway, unsure if he was ready. The stranger watched him with hope mixed with fear, his eyes silently urging Jacob forward. Every second that passed seemed to stretch into minutes, yet the urgency in the stranger's voice reminded Jacob that hesitation could have consequences. "Listen," Jacob said, keeping his voice calm. "I need to understand the full story before I can do anything. You have to be honest with me. Were you involved in anything that might have caused these men to chase you?" The stranger shook his head vehemently. "No, I swear I did nothing wrong. They are lying and they want to punish me before anyone can prove it. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found someone willing to listen. Please just help me." Jacob felt a flicker of trust grow. He could see that the man was telling the truth, or at least telling the truth as he believed it. He could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the exhaustion etched into his face, and in the sincerity of his voice. Jacob knew that taking action now would mean going against the unspoken codes of the ranchers, but he also knew that doing nothing could be a far greater betrayal. He glanced around the property, considering the isolation of the land. The vast expanse of plains stretched in every direction, with no neighbors in sight. This was both a risk and an opportunity. The men chasing the stranger would have difficulty finding him here without drawing attention, but they could still arrive unexpectedly. Jacob had to act carefully, not just to help the man, but to protect everyone on his ranch. He thought of his cattle, the barns, and the home he had built, realizing that choosing compassion required courage and strategy. Jacob's fingers brushed against the rope again, this time with more determination. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm going to help you, but you have to trust me and stay calm. Understand?" The stranger nodded eagerly, relief washing over his face, but the tension remained. Jacob could sense that the real test had only just begun. The moment he untied the rope, he would be taking a stand, both against the tradition he had always known and for the principle of helping someone in need. The wind carried a quiet rustle through the dry grass, and Jacob felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The sun had begun to dip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the land. It was a reminder that time was slipping away and the decision could not be postponed. The stranger's voice, still trembling but steadier now, urged him on. "Please, you're my only hope. I don't know what I would do if you leave me like this." Jacob took a steadying breath. He remembered the stories of his father, the lessons about courage, fairness, and honor. He realized that life in the Wild West was often harsh and unforgiving, and sometimes the hardest choice was to act with humanity when the world demanded caution. He knelt slightly, making his hands visible and calm, showing the stranger that he meant no harm. Slowly, carefully, he began to work on the knots that bound the man's hands. As he untied the rope, the stranger flinched slightly at first, then relaxed, letting Jacob work. Each loop of rope removed was like a small step toward freedom, both literal and symbolic. Jacob could feel the tension in the air begin to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. When the last knot came free, the stranger rubbed his wrists and whispered a quiet, almost reverent, "Thank you, I don't know how to repay you." Jacob stood back, observing the man closely. He could see the relief and exhaustion in his posture, and he knew that this moment was significant, not just for the stranger but for himself. Breaking tradition had been difficult, yet it felt right. It felt like the kind of action his father would have respected, the kind that showed strength not through fear or power, but through compassion and judgment. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jacob felt the weight of the day lift slightly, replaced by a quiet determination. The stranger was now free to explain everything, and Jacob was ready to listen, ready to act, and ready to face whatever consequences might come. In that moment, amidst the sprawling ranch and the endless plains, a new chapter of understanding, trust, and courage began to unfold. The sun had nearly vanished behind the distant hills, and the ranch was bathed in a golden-orange glow. Jacob Thornton stood silently, watching the stranger rub his wrists and regain his composure. Despite the calming light, the tension of the day hung thick in the air. Jacob could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. He had broken the unspoken rules of the ranching community by helping an outsider without verification. He knew that some neighbors would disapprove, maybe even consider him reckless. Yet, he could not ignore the feeling in his heart that he had done the right thing. The stranger, now breathing a little easier, straightened up and wiped sweat from his forehead. "I can't thank you enough," he said quietly, his voice still trembling. "If you hadn't helped me, I don't even want to think about what might have happened." Jacob nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon as the wind whispered across the plains. He still felt cautious. The men chasing the stranger could arrive at any moment, and he had no idea what danger they might bring. But he also understood that staying paralyzed by fear would solve nothing. Action had to come next, carefully and decisively. Jacob took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "We need to figure out the next step. You can't stay here exposed. If those men follow you, it could put both of us at risk. We need a plan." The stranger nodded eagerly, relief flickering across his face. His trust in Jacob had grown, but he still carried the exhaustion and fear of someone who had been running for days. Jacob could see that his appearance alone, dirty, tired, disheveled, told the story of the miles he had traveled, the nights spent in hiding, and the constant worry about being caught. Jacob led the man toward a small outbuilding near the edge of the ranch, a place usually used for storing tools and feed. "We can get you inside here for the night," he said. "It's not much, but it's safe. You'll be out of sight, and we can think about what to do in the morning." The stranger followed cautiously, glancing around at the wide-open land, as if expecting danger to come from every direction. Jacob felt a surge of protectiveness. This man was vulnerable, but he also had a story that demanded respect, courage, and careful thought. Once inside the outbuilding, Jacob motioned for the stranger to sit. He pulled a small blanket from a corner and offered it. "You need to rest. You look like you haven't slept in days." The stranger accepted the blanket with gratitude, wrapping it around his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered again, eyes glistening with emotion. "I've never met anyone like you before, Most people, they wouldn't have stopped. They would have called the authorities or worse, left me for them to find. Jacob nodded silently, understanding the truth in the words. The Wild West was a harsh place, where people were often judged quickly and justice was not always fair. Compassion was rare, and courage came at a personal cost. As the stranger rested, Jacob stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He watched the plains stretch endlessly into the distance. The wind carried the faint sound of cattle moving in the distance and the soft rustle of grass over the rolling hills. For a moment, Jacob allowed himself to breathe, to think without immediate pressure. Yet, even in this quiet, he knew the weight of his choice was not over. By helping the man, he had taken on responsibility, not just for the stranger's safety, but for the consequences of defying the traditional rules of his community. Jacob thought of his neighbors, the other ranchers he had grown up with. Some would respect him for his courage, but others might see this as a reckless act. The codes of the West were strict, and breaking them could bring judgment. But Jacob understood something deeper. The codes were meant to protect, not to blind. When tradition demanded cruelty or inaction in the face of injustice, it was no longer honorable. Helping someone in true need, even when it went against convention, was the real measure of character. As night fell, Jacob returned to the outbuilding. He sat across from the stranger, who was now quieter, calmer. "Tell me everything," Jacob said. "Every detail you can remember. I need to understand the full story if we're going to keep you safe." The stranger took a deep breath and began to recount the events leading to his flight. He spoke of false accusations in a nearby town, of people who had believed lies without proof, and of the fear that had driven him from place to place. Jacob listened intently, absorbing every detail. He could see the truth in the man's eyes, the sincerity in his voice. Hours passed as the two men spoke. Jacob asked careful questions, not to doubt the stranger but to understand the situation fully. He wanted to know who the pursuers were, what their intentions might be, and how the stranger could remain safe. The story painted a picture of desperation and injustice, and Jacob felt both anger and sympathy. The men chasing the stranger were not concerned with fairness or truth. They were motivated by their own prejudices and need for control. Jacob realized that helping the stranger was not just an act of kindness. It was a stand against injustice itself. As the night deepened, Jacob felt the responsibility of his choice settle firmly on his shoulders. He had made a decision that could change the course of both their lives. If the pursuers came, he would have to protect the man and himself, potentially risking conflict. But he also knew that turning back now would be a betrayal of his own principles. Courage, he reminded himself, was not simply the absence of fear. It was acting rightly even when the risk was great. The stranger, sensing Jacob's thoughtful silence, looked up with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped me," he said softly. Jacob nodded, understanding that words were not enough. Actions mattered more. "Rest now," Jacob replied. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps. You need your strength if you're going to make it through this." As he watched the stranger settle in, Jacob thought about the community he belonged to. Tradition had been a guiding force in his life, but tonight he had realized that true honor was more than following rules. It was making the right choice when the rules seemed to demand the wrong one. He thought of his father again, of the lessons about fairness, courage, and integrity. He felt a sense of clarity that had been missing before. Helping someone in need was not just an act of defiance. It was an act of humanity, and it was worth the risk. The wind outside shifted, carrying the distant howl of a coyote. The vastness of the plains seemed to stretch endlessly, a reminder of both freedom and danger. Jacob knew that the coming days would require vigilance, careful planning, and bravery. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the daily routines of ranch life. He had made a choice that mattered, and now he had to see it through. As he settled down for a brief rest himself, Jacob reflected on the lesson the night had brought. Life in the Wild West was unpredictable, harsh, and often unjust. But courage, compassion, and wisdom could guide even the most difficult decisions. He had acted not out of fear or adherence to tradition, but out of understanding and moral responsibility. And in that choice, he found a quiet satisfaction that no approval or recognition could match. Outside, the stars began to appear, twinkling over the plains like distant fires. Jacob looked at them for a moment, thinking of the vastness of the world and the smallness of human life in comparison. Yet, in his small corner of the land, he had made a difference. He had given a man a chance to survive, to prove himself, and to live another day. That act, Jacob realized, was the true measure of courage, not the traditions of men but the choices of a man's heart. The night wore on and the ranch grew quiet. Jacob remained alert, listening to every sound, ready to respond if danger came. But the sense of relief in the outbuilding, the quiet gratitude of the stranger, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing gave him a feeling of calm he had not expected. He had faced the tension between tradition and morality, fear and courage, and he had chosen to act with honor. By the time the first light of dawn touched the plains, Jacob had made a decision about what would come next. The stranger was safe for now, but their journey together was just beginning. Jacob knew that the days ahead would require more than strength. They would demand wisdom, patience, and unwavering courage. And as the sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light over the sprawling ranch, Jacob felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had chosen rightly, even when tradition had told him otherwise. The first light of dawn stretched across the plains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The wind had calmed, leaving the ranch in a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred. Jacob Thornton rose early, as he always did, moving quietly through the outbuilding where the stranger was resting. The man was still asleep, curled up under the blanket Jacob had offered the night before. His face showed the weariness of a journey that had been long, difficult, and full of fear. Jacob studied him for a moment, seeing not just a stranger, but someone who had endured hardships many could not imagine. Jacob knew that the time for hesitation was over. The night had allowed for reflection, but now action was required. The stranger's story was not complete, and the danger he faced was real. The men chasing him were likely still following his trail, motivated by lies and prejudice. Jacob felt a surge of determination. He had chosen to help, and now he had to see it through. This was more than a moral choice. It was a responsibility he could not ignore. He gently shook the stranger awake. "It's time to talk," Jacob said softly. "We need to figure out what really happened and what we're going to do next." The stranger stirred, blinking against the morning light. His voice was hoarse, but there was gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped me last night." Jacob nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Now tell me everything, every detail you can remember. We need to be prepared." The stranger took a deep breath and began to speak. He told Jacob about the events that had led him to flee across the plains, about the false accusations made against him in a nearby town. He spoke of the men who had accused him, wealthy ranchers who had influence and power, people who believed themselves above the law. They had claimed he had stolen livestock, but the truth was different. He had only been in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to help a neighbor who had been injured. His efforts had been misunderstood, twisted into lies by those who wanted to protect their own interests. As the stranger spoke, Jacob listened intently. He felt a mixture of anger and sympathy rise within him. The Wild West was a place where survival often depended on power, money, and influence rather than justice. Innocent people could easily become targets, and rumors could turn into threats. Yet, the stranger's story was not just about injustice. It was about courage, resourcefulness, and the struggle to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world. Jacob felt a growing respect for the man before him. Despite exhaustion and fear, he had not given up. The stranger explained how he had been pursued for days, moving from town to town, hiding during the day and traveling at night. He spoke of sleeping under trees, finding water in small creeks, and avoiding the main roads where the men might spot him. He told Jacob about the moments of despair, when it seemed like there was no hope left, and the moments of small victories when he had managed to evade capture by a hair. Each story painted a vivid picture of determination and resilience. Jacob could see the truth in the stranger's eyes. There was no deceit, only a desperate will to survive. The man had been pushed to the edge, yet he had not lost his humanity. Jacob felt a sense of admiration. Helping him was no longer just a matter of moral choice. It was a matter of standing for justice in a world where fairness was often scarce. He knew that the decision he had made the night before, to untie the ropes and offer shelter, had been the right one. As the morning light grew stronger, the stranger shared more about the men pursuing him. They were relentless, organized, and driven by a sense of entitlement. They had wealth, influence, and a network of informants who could track his movements. Jacob realized that helping the stranger would not be simple. It would require planning, strategy, and vigilance. But he also understood that standing by while injustice prevailed was not an option. The man's life was at stake, and Jacob could not turn away. The conversation turned to the stranger's skills and knowledge. Despite being pursued, he had managed to survive by thinking ahead, making careful choices, and using the land to his advantage. He knew how to move quietly, where to find water, and how to stay hidden. Jacob was impressed by his resourcefulness. "You've been through a lot," Jacob said. "But with your skills and my land, we can make a plan to keep you safe until we can figure out what to do next." The stranger nodded, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since their meeting. Jacob spent the next hours walking the property with the stranger, showing him the best hiding spots, the small streams for water, and the safe areas where he could rest without being seen. They discussed what to do if the pursuers arrived, how to stay alert, and how to communicate quietly. Jacob realized that this was not just a test of courage, it was a test of trust. The stranger needed to trust him completely, and Jacob needed to trust that the man would follow instructions. Their cooperation was essential for survival. As they worked together, Jacob reflected on the lessons of the night before. Breaking tradition had been difficult, but it had allowed him to see the man's true character. He had learned that rules were important, but they were not absolute. Humanity, compassion, and judgment sometimes required bending or even breaking the rules. The stranger's plight had reminded him that life was not always fair, and that courage often meant making choices that others might not understand. By midday, the two men had developed a plan. The stranger would remain on the ranch, hidden and protected, while Jacob would contact a trusted friend in the neighboring town to verify the stranger's story. They would gather evidence of the false accusations and ensure that the men pursuing him could not act unjustly. Jacob felt a sense of purpose and clarity. The danger was real, but so was the opportunity to do what was right. The stranger expressed his gratitude again, and Jacob could see the relief in his posture. "I don't know how to thank you enough," he said. Jacob smiled slightly. "Just survive. That's enough for now." He understood that actions mattered more than words. The stranger had been given a chance, and it was up to both of them to see it through. As the afternoon sun climbed high, Jacob noticed a shift in the stranger's demeanor. He seemed lighter, less fearful, more confident. The fear that had dominated his face yesterday had begun to fade, replaced by determination. Jacob knew that the man's courage had been strengthened by the trust he had been shown. This was a turning point, not just for the stranger but for Jacob as well. He realized that helping others could reveal strengths in both the helper and the helped. The day wore on, and Jacob remained vigilant. Every sound, every shadow, and every movement in the distance held potential significance. Yet, he also felt a sense of calm, a confidence born of preparation and moral certainty. The stranger had shared his story fully, and Jacob now had the knowledge and understanding to protect him. The tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed into focus and determination. As evening approached, the sun began to set once more, casting the ranch in long shadows. Jacob and the stranger sat quietly, watching the colors change across the plains. "Tomorrow," Jacob said softly, "we'll take the next step. For now, rest." "You've earned it." The stranger nodded, grateful but still wary. Jacob could see that the journey ahead would be challenging, but he also knew that with trust, planning, and courage, they could face whatever came. Jacob reflected on the lessons of the day. The stranger's story had revealed more than just the dangers of the West. It had revealed the resilience of the human spirit. Injustice and fear were real, but so were courage and integrity. By choosing to help, he had made a difference, not just for one man but for the principle of justice itself. The night would come, and with it the challenges, but Jacob felt ready. He had acted rightly, and he would continue to do so, no matter the cost. The stars appeared one by one over the plains, twinkling like distant promises of hope. Jacob and the stranger sat quietly, understanding that the day's revelations had changed them both. The stranger had shared his story, and Jacob had chosen to act with courage and compassion. Together, they were prepared to face the challenges ahead, knowing that the bond of trust they had formed was stronger than fear, stronger than tradition, and stronger than the dangers of the West. The morning sun rose slowly over the Wyoming plains, casting its warm, golden light across Jacob Thornton's ranch. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the scent of dry grass and earth. Jacob stood at the edge of the property, looking out across the open fields. He felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. The events of the past days had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Helping the stranger, breaking the long-held traditions of the ranching community, and standing against injustice had required courage. But the test was not yet over. The stranger had rested well through the night, gathering his strength for whatever came next. Jacob had instructed him on how to remain vigilant while staying hidden, and he had prepared carefully for any sign of the men who had been pursuing him. The plans were simple, but they required focus and trust. Jacob knew that vigilance would be key. One mistake could undo everything they had worked for. He glanced at the outbuilding where the stranger was staying and felt a quiet pride in the bond they had formed. It was a bond built on trust, courage, and shared humanity, and it would guide them through the challenges to come. Jacob called the stranger out and handed him a small bundle of food and water. "You'll need strength," he said quietly. "Keep your eyes and ears open. Today, we start taking steps to make sure you are safe for good." The stranger nodded, his face showing a mixture of determination and gratitude. He had grown more confident over the past days, but the tension was still evident. This was not the end of his journey, and the shadow of danger still lingered. Jacob led the stranger to a higher vantage point on the ranch, a small hill that overlooked the surrounding plains. From there, they could see for miles in every direction. Jacob pointed out key areas, hidden paths, water sources, and possible spots where danger could approach. "If anyone comes, you need to be ready," he said. "But we're not just going to hide. We'll also make sure the truth comes to light. You don't need to run anymore." The stranger listened intently, realizing that Jacob was not only providing protection, but also helping him reclaim his life. The plan they devised was careful and deliberate. Jacob would contact a trusted friend in the nearby town, someone who understood the law and could help verify the stranger's story. They would gather evidence of the false accusations, collect witnesses, and ensure that the men chasing him could not act unjustly. This required patience and strategy, but Jacob felt confident. The stranger had proven himself resourceful, and together they could turn the tide. As they worked through the day, Jacob thought about the lessons he had learned. Helping the stranger had tested his courage, challenged his understanding of tradition, and strengthened his belief in doing what was right. He realized that life in the Wild West was not just about survival. It was about choices, principles, and standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. The world could be harsh and unfair, but one man's actions could make a difference, and Jacob had made that difference. Word of the stranger's presence and Jacob's actions began to spread quietly among nearby ranchers. Some were skeptical, whispering about the breach of tradition. Others admired Jacob's courage, though they might not have said so aloud. Jacob did not concern himself with gossip or judgment. He knew that the right path was not always the popular one. His responsibility was to protect the man in front of him and to ensure that justice, rather than fear or prejudice, prevailed. By late afternoon, Jacob's trusted friend arrived from the town, bringing news and assistance. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing information about the accusations, the pursuers, and potential strategies. Jacob explained the situation in detail, emphasizing the danger and the urgency. His friend listened carefully and agreed to help, recognizing the injustice that had forced the stranger to flee. Together, they developed a plan to verify the truth and provide protection if needed. The sense of support gave Jacob a renewed confidence. He was not alone in his decision, and the stranger had allies now. As evening fell, Jacob and the stranger sat quietly outside the outbuilding, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The plains were bathed in warm orange and pink hues, and the wind carried the soft sound of distant cattle and rustling grass. The stranger spoke softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You saved my life, not just by protecting me, but by believing in me when no one else would." Jacob smiled, feeling the weight of the moment. "You've earned it," he replied. "The courage you've shown matters more than words." The night brought a calm that felt almost sacred. Jacob remained vigilant, listening to every sound and observing the shadows. But he also allowed himself to reflect on the events that had brought them to this point. Helping the stranger had been a choice that tested everything he believed about tradition, courage, and morality. It had shown him that true honor was not found in rigid rules, but in the decisions one made in the face of uncertainty and danger. Over the next several days, they implemented the plan carefully. Evidence was gathered, witnesses were found, and the truth of the stranger's story began to emerge. The men who had pursued him were confronted, not with violence but with facts and accountability. The stranger's name was cleared, and the threat that had loomed over him gradually faded. Jacob observed the transformation with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been restored, not through force or fear, but through careful action, courage, and integrity. The bond between Jacob and the stranger grew stronger through these days. They shared stories of their past, hopes for the future, and the understanding that they had been brought together for a reason. The stranger spoke of the kindness and bravery he had never expected to encounter, and Jacob reflected on the importance of trust and compassion. Their connection was not just about survival. It was about mutual respect and the recognition of what it meant to act with honor in a world that often seemed unfair. As the final threat passed and the stranger's safety was secured, Jacob felt a deep sense of relief and fulfillment. The choice he had made to help, to break tradition, to trust his instincts, had proven correct. It had not been easy, and the consequences could have been severe, but the outcome validated his courage and judgment. He realized that true bravery was not about risking life for glory or recognition, but about making the right choice when faced with fear, uncertainty, and pressure from society. The stranger prepared to leave the ranch, now able to live his life free from fear and false accusations. He turned to Jacob with gratitude shining in his eyes. "I will never forget what you've done for me," he said. "I owe my life to you, and I will honor it every day." Jacob nodded, understanding that the act of helping someone had created a ripple of goodness that would extend far beyond the ranch. "Live well," Jacob replied. "That is thanks enough." As the stranger rode off toward a safer path, Jacob watched him go, feeling both sadness and pride. Their paths had crossed at a crucial moment, and the bond they had formed would remain in Jacob's memory forever. The plain stretched endlessly before him, filled with the promise of new challenges and new choices. Jacob understood that life would continue to test him, but he now carried the confidence that he could act with courage and integrity, no matter the circumstances. Returning to the ranch, Jacob walked among his cattle, checking fences and making small repairs. The work was familiar, comforting, and grounding, yet everything had changed. He had seen the fragility of life, the injustice that could strike anyone, and the power of compassion to make a real difference. The experience had reshaped his understanding of honor, courage, and the meaning of community. He knew that true respect came not from rigid adherence to tradition, but from the choices one made when it mattered most. As the sun set once more, Jacob stood on the porch of his home, looking out across the plains. The wind carried the scent of grass, dust, and freedom. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had acted rightly, that the stranger was safe, and that he had upheld the values he truly believed in. Life on the ranch would continue, filled with its daily routines and challenges, but the memory of the past days would remain a defining chapter in his life. Jacob reflected on the lessons he had learned. Courage was not the absence of fear, honor was not blind adherence to rules, and compassion was a force stronger than any tradition. By helping someone in need, he had discovered a truth about himself and the world around him, that humanity, integrity, and courage were the qualities that truly defined a man. He smiled quietly, feeling a sense of fulfillment and hope for the future. The stars began to appear over the plains, twinkling in the clear night sky. Jacob felt a quiet connection to the land, to the people he had helped, and to the choices he had made. The stranger's story had ended on a hopeful note, and Jacob's own story continued, enriched by the lessons of courage, compassion, and integrity. In the vastness of the Wild West, amidst challenges and uncertainty, he had found clarity, purpose, and a renewed understanding of what it meant to live with honor. As the night deepened, Jacob finally settled inside his home, feeling a calm that came from knowing he had done what was right. The ranch was quiet, the cattle resting peacefully, and the wind carrying whispers of the endless plains. He closed his eyes, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, the stranger, the choices, the risk, and the courage it had taken. Life in the West was harsh, unpredictable, and often unfair, but he had proven to himself that integrity and compassion could triumph, even in the most challenging circumstances. And in that quiet night, with the stars shining above and the ranch calm around him, Jacob Thornton knew that the decision he had made, choosing humanity over rigid tradition, was the one that would define him forever.